you actually did a really good treatment of the sort of the John Conyers bill. Has a record number of sponsors, co-sponsors in the House. John Conyers, of course, I mean, is a sort of just venerable, progressive politician, very important figure, and you took a look at what it would actually do, and now, of course, we have Bernie coming forward in the Senate. I guess touch briefly on the Conyers bill, and are we setting up that even in the best case scenario we kill Graham-Cassidy? Because that must happen, and I say that as someone who's obviously quite pro single payer, but there's no doubt that this bill needs to be killed. It will harm a lot of people, but that they're going to keep trying, and the Democratic Party seems to be kind of moving in a more coherent direction on this. So is this a preview of the war that we're going to have for the next foreseeable political future? An actual progressive national insurance plan, and then various efforts to just roll back the. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, to give a sort of an overview of the Conyers bill and the Sanders plans.
Yeah.
The Conyers bill has sort of been reintroduced every few years, and it's almost like a napkin sketch is sort of like the right way to think about it. I think it's only 30 pages. The story I wrote about it was only 200 words shorter than the actual bill text. And so what it really does is it's sort of just if progressives could imagine their ideal healthcare system and just threw it all in there, what would it look like? And that's sort of what the Conyers bill does. And the way this works is it says instead of having this complicated system where you have private, 50% of Americans are on private health insurance through their employer, and if they lose a job, if they're unemployed, if they have to, if they get fired for some reason, then they're suddenly without care. You can go on to Medicaid, but it takes time. It's very expensive. Even then even the public options and even the private options have significant cost sharing. So if you are a poorly paid worker, you can have deductibles and premiums that are a huge financial strain or put you into medical debt, even if you have insurance. That's not counting the 28 million people who don't have insurance. So we had this crazy quote system, and the Conyers plan says screw all that. Let's just have one single government insurer that covers everyone at no cost. Everyone can get as much health care as they want, and we'll pay for it by higher taxes on the middle and upper classes. And critics say that the middle class tax hikes required would be substantial, but in exchange for no health care spending the rest of your life is a pretty good counter offer to
you'll save
6 or 7% payroll tax increase.
No doubt, you'll save. Yeah.
The Conyers bill has a bunch of other really interesting features that are just sort of wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? So it calls on eliminating all for-profit hospitals, for instance. It has these plans for states to run their own Medicare for all offices that would coordinate coverage in the entire state. It would sort of be like the death panels thing that Obama was demagogued for, but not invented. Actually, they would have panels responsible for deciding the allocation of medical resources in a way that would make it much more efficient. We spend more than any other country on healthcare by a factor of 3 or 4, and get worse outcomes. So this is a way of taking private insurers, pharmaceutical companies, and saying we're going to do this in a rational way that improves people's care, reduces overall spending, and also guarantees that everyone can get insurance regardless of their income and status.
Yep.
So this was sort of the aspirational plan that has existed for years in this Conyers House plan. And Sanders, who obviously sort of catalyzed this huge movement, now has millions of followers, did very well in the Democratic primary, although obviously he lost. This single-payer bill that Sanders reintroduced was an attempt to take the existing single-payer plans that have been introduced in Congress and say, how do we actually create that single-payer system? What would that actually mean? How would we actually go about doing that? we want to have every American off their existing plan and onto this one government-run Medicare for all plan. How do we go about doing that? And Sanders' plan, the biggest innovation in it is it calls for a 4-year transition phase-in, where you'd first cover everyone up to 18 on this Medicare for all plan, and then everyone age 55 and older in the first year. The second year, that age eligibility would be dropped down to 45, and then 35 until in the fourth year, everyone would have a Medicare card that would give them free insurance. So that was like the way in which I think a lot of Senate Democrats said, oh, I already stand for dropping the Medicare enrollment age from 65 to 55. Mm-hmm. Once you do that, then you say, oh, let's do another 10 years, another 10 years, another 10 years.
Right.
And in sort of a subtle way, Sanders scaled back like a little bit of the ambition and the immediacy and the radicalness of his single-payer bill in a way that allowed 17, basically a third of the Senate Democratic caucus, to get behind what was once this incredibly radical left-wing proposal, at least as it was regarded.
Yeah. So, I mean, and it seems like it is fitting. I mean, the structural impediment to Democrats really moving in a more firmly kind of progressive or left direction is, the bottleneck in American politics is obviously just money and, the sort of set of interests that are represented by money. So it's harder for for sort of parties to flow into natural categories. And Democrats are obviously also a more complicated coalition party as well, with a number of different kind of historical influences. But that said, I mean, and as a final question, I mean, healthcare being the kind of preeminent thing, that Medicare for all has sort of come as a stand-in, as a policy in and of itself, and then also broadly more reflective of, are you going to think about, monopoly issues in today's world? Are we going to have to start, when are we going to start having to think about breaking up Google and Amazon? And, how serious are you about inequality and dealing with globalization? And that
the way you frame it is exactly the same as Sanders, actually.
Right.
I think that it's worth noting, and I interviewed him about his bill, and I asked him, like the wonks in the Democratic Party will say, blah, 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 blah. What do you think about it? And his reaction I thought was interesting. He said, direct quote, "This is not really a healthcare debate."
Right.
He thinks this is about whether the public will get together to stand up to concentrated economic power.
That's right.
That the fundamental question is not how you write a good single-payer bill. The fundamental question is, can the public will overcome the stranglehold of the 1% on the nation's capital? Sort of as you were suggesting, there's a belief out there, and I think for it, that more than half of Americans think the government has a responsibility to pay for people's care, and public opinion shows that the pharmaceutical companies are extremely unpopular, and this varies depending on how you frame the questions. But depending on the tax increase, like most Americans are willing to pay a little bit more to make sure everyone has free universal care. And so he does not see this as a sort of wonkish policy debate. He sees it as a question of political power. Can we build the political power to transform the nation's economy? And I think that ties in really well with your second question of are Democrats going to be the party that takes on the trusts, that goes after Google and Amazon, that doesn't let sort of these massive consolidations that are really bad for prices and really bad for consumers. And I think Sanders believes that, if we can, as he would put it, create the political revolution that did it. And this sounds super airy and kind of naive and idealistic, I think, sometimes, but you really only have to go back to to 2008 to see what happens when you dramatically goose the number of people involved in the political process. Right. Obama's victory did transform the number of people in American politics, and as a result, transformed the policy debate in Washington. And so,
and I would argue, not so. And I just to add to that, before we wrap, and tell me what you think of this. there's a broader debate, which I see as a very false one, pivoting sort of the struggle that Sanders is articulating, which is these sort of defining issues of the time, with also the other defining issues of social justice, social emancipation, and various categories, racism, sexism, and all of these things. And obviously, I think, clearly from my perspective, the Obama economic and sort of policy set was third way, was Clintonian, not nearly enough to the left, and in some ways with Silicon Valley, just a problem in and of itself. But that election, I don't think you'd have the backlash and and just how sort of obscenity of Trump and the grotesqueness of the sort of resurgent racism, but you also would not have this sort of reconfigured map of what had been speculated about, of a genuine multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-geographic coalition that could sustain some form of center left or centrist to now hopefully actually progressive governance. That was demonstrated and exemplified by Obama, and the positive currents of those types of liberations and improvements are absolutely set in the context of him winning in 2008. So not only was that energy leveraged, I think sometimes on our side, we just go to the narrative where it was like, and I should say like my side, not to speak for you, just that, oh, well, all this great energy happened and then nothing really radical happened on Wall Street and healthcare and all the rest. I basically agree with that narrative, but I also think there's a whole other set of concerns and issues, representation and power, that actually was accelerated significantly by that win and demonstrated the value of it.
I think that's definitely right. And if you look at sort of the main things that concerned people about Hillary Clinton, one of the biggest things, of course, was the Goldman speeches and the Wall Street speeches. Right. And I don't know, I found like a lot of these debates over whether Trump's victory was due to economic anxiety in the populace or racism to be sort of reductive.
Yes.
Obviously, it's both, but
right.
To say that that it is an incontestable force, that Trump's racism and the racist climate he tapped into were so powerful that nothing could be done to stop it with a more progressive and a more inclusive and a more robust economic message that didn't associate Democrats with plutocrats, it is not only, to me, it's not just, I think it's wrong, but I don't understand, if you do think it's right, what the purpose of saying it is. Like, if you really believe that Democrats, that there's nothing they could have done to be less associated with a plutocratic class, that because they were associated with a multicultural coalition and America is irredeemably racist, that Trump's victory was inevitable, then like what is the point of any of this? Like if that is your perspective, like what do you do?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Hi folks, Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos